This is an A-level presentation looking at populations and ecosystems and the concept of succession. There are a number of terminologies that you should be aware of when dealing with populations and ecosystems. At this point, any of the words in front of you on the left-hand side of the screen that you don't know, you need to go and look up and memorize. You should be able to write a definition for each one. Pause the presentation now, take a few minutes, go through your definitions, and then you can restart the presentation when you're ready and see how you would have done. So pause the presentation now. And let's have a look at some answers. So we're talking about abiotic factors, we're talking about the non-living factors. A microhabitat is simply a habitat found within a larger habitat. A biosphere is the region on the surface of the planet, in the atmosphere of the planet, that's occupied by life. And that's important, it has to be occupied by life. The biotic is all living factors. Population is a group of organisms of the same species in the same habitat at the same time. A niche is how an organism fits into its environment, including the biotic and abiotic factors. And carrying capacity is the maximum size of a population that can be supported by any particular ecosystem. In this particular presentation, we're going to look at succession, how it changes over time and its impact on ecosystems and biodiversity, and then do a little bit of examples in unfamiliar contexts. So succession refers to how a population and the number of populations found inside any particular environment at any particular time and how it progresses and changes over time. It's how each new species and each new population can change in environments, abiotic factors, and as a consequence can make it less hostile for a particular species to move in. So we talk about more hostile and less hostile and how that changes the environment for different species. The standard type of succession you see is the succession on dry land, where you start with bare ground. You then progress on to herb, then smaller plants, larger plants, and eventually onto a mature forest. What you should do at this point is pause the presentation and use this image to describe the stages of succession. You should go a step further and try and include how the animal communities would develop parallel to the development of plant succession. So pause the presentation now. So when we talk about stages of succession, there's some very specific terminology you must always include. In any question in an A-level paper that talks about succession, you need to use these words, because just using these words in a sentence often will pick you up marks. We always start with what's called a pioneering species. That is the first species to populate or colonize a particular area. Quite often it is some kind of microorganism or some sort of algae. Quite often it will produce asexually. It needs to be photosynthesizing because obviously there's nothing there for it to use as a food source. And quite often it can be nitrogen fixing, get its nitrogen sources from the air. What then happens is over time, through a mixture of weathering and decomposition of that colonizing pioneering species, we end up with a small amount of nutrient medium that smaller organisms are then able to grow in. As they then grow, we have more and more organic material that dead and then decays. That provides more nutrients, and eventually we develop an area that is hospitable for mosses to move in, where we can start having storage of water inside that medium as well. Once we start having a nutrient medium with a water store in it, that's when we can start having flowering plants move in, and small flowering plants to start with, and over a period of time larger and larger plants, until eventually we get to what's called a climax community. And the climax community is where there's very little change in that particular community. It's where we've basically got the end product, often in the form of dense forest if we let it go wild, but there may be variations on it depending what examples they talk about in the exam. In terms of in the animal kingdom, The organic plants provide a food source and a source of shelter for many of the animal kingdom, so you need to get to certain stages in the plant development and plant succession in order for the area to become hospitable for the animal kingdom to move in and provide enough of a food source or habitat for different levels of the animal kingdom. So regardless of what type of environment you're talking about, succession has common steps involved in it going through any of the stages. And it doesn't matter if you're moving from the pioneering species all the way up to the climax community. In front of you, you have 5 images that represent these different stages. What you should do now is pause the presentation, try and work out what each of these pictures represents, and when you're ready, you can replay the presentation. If you don't know what these pictures represent, you can't work out the stages, you obviously need to take the time to memorize it, or you're not going to be able to talk about succession in those long answer questions in the exam. So pause your presentation now and restart when you're ready to go through the answers. Okay, so let's have a look at the answers. The first symbol is a peace symbol, and what it basically talks about is that the abiotic environment has to become less hostile. For some reason, the abiotic environment has to become less hostile, and quite often that's because a particular species has already moved in. When that happens, we now have an increase in number of and variety of habitats and niches. So we've got more habitats available for more species, and obviously we've got more niches involved because we've now got different biotic and abiotic factors. That in turn leads to an increase in biodiversity. What will then happen is we'll have stabilization of that community. So we'll have an increased biodiversity, but then things will balance out and level out so that it's a stabilized community. When we do that, we have more complex food webs. With more biodiversity, we have more complex food webs as more things have, more organisms have more prey and more organisms have more predators. And what will eventually lead to is an increase in biomass. So if you think of the amount of organic material that would exist whenever you have a community just colonizing bare rock versus the amount of biomass in a large dense forest, obviously the one that's reached climax community has a much higher biomass. We can talk about succession in different types of environments, and one of the ones that's quite common comes up in the exam is they take it away from dry land and they put it into an aquatic environment, either some kind of pond or lake or some sort of water source. So what you have to do is describe the process of succession that would have occurred over the next 100 years to convert the pond into the small forest. You can pause the presentation now, do your best to come up with an answer. After sort of 7 or 8 minutes, that's really the amount of time you should be taking. This is a 6-mark question. So after 7 or 8 minutes, you can stop what you're doing and then have a look at the answers. So pause the presentation now. So a couple of questions to go through, just to break it down and make it a little easier. What has to happen for succession to occur? Well, for succession to occur, we have to have less water and more nutrients forming soil. If we just have all that water, we will never get to the forest. We need large amounts of soil and large amounts of nutrients. Well, where do the nutrients come from? Well, the nutrients come from basically living things that have died and decomposed. Mostly in and around an aquatic environment, it'll be dead matter dropping off the surrounding vegetation in the form of dead leaves. The last thing you gotta do is identify the following words or phrases that should be in your answer. So again, pause the presentation, have a go, see if you can work out what the words are, and when you're ready, you can restart the presentation. So pause the presentation now. Let's have a look at the answers. So the CO stands for colonization, the B stands for biodiversity, the L is for less hostile, P for pioneering species, climax community, and of course competition. These are all the terminologies that you must include in your answer when describing the succession in this particular environment in order to get all the way from the aquatic environment up to the climax community, which would be the forest. So look through, find these words in your answer, and if they're not there, memorize them and have another go at your answer and include them second time round. So this is an example of the kind of answer you could put together for that question. And as you can see, we've talked about where the dead organic materials come from in the form of leaves. We've talked about an increase in nutrients. We've talked about the fact that colonization of the water by photosynthetic organisms could also provide more organic matter that could decay and provide nutrients. With more nutrient medium, we've then talked about the fact that the environment is less hostile, so things like mosses can move in, which would then start storing water. This would then provide an environment for flowering plants. We then progress all the way through saying this repeats, making it less hostile, new species move in, colonize the area. We've increased the biodiversity until there's stabilization of the community, and then we've talked about climax community and how the climax community would, in this particular case, be the small forest. We do have this concept called secondary succession, and secondary succession is when we have reached a climax community but we've had some kind of major event that's caused significant damage to an ecosystem, for example a forest fire. As a consequence, we've regressed from the climax community, but we will again, succession will continue and progress back to the climax community. But the climax community isn't always the same as the original climax community, but it will occur much faster than normal succession on the bare ground because we already have soil, we already have nutrients, and with the, in particular with the forest fire, all of that organic matter will have been broken down and left on the ground, and as a consequence there's a high level of nutrients in the soil. We also have a number of spores, and plants will drop spores into the ground already, so it's already colonized and they will quickly move in. And animals again will have obviously left during the fire, but will return very, very quickly when the plant life starts to reappear. So we'll have a much faster return to the climax community than we originally would have, moving in this case from the young forest to the mature forest. So just to finish off, I'd like to summarize all the information in this presentation and try and squeeze it all into one flow diagram that will cover the process of succession and the terminologies you need to include on any question on the A-level paper relating to succession. Pause the presentation, and when you're ready you can restart to have a look at the suggested flow diagram. So pause the presentation now. So what you've got now is just a suggested sequence. There's no particular, it has to be in this order, but there are definite terminologies you must include. You must talk about a pioneering species, you must talk about nutrient layers, nutrient mediums, you must talk about climax community, you must talk about the fact that the environment becomes less hostile, more biodiversity, etc, etc, etc. So make sure you go back through, add and edit your flow diagram if you need to, watch the presentation again, get as many terminologies in there as possible because it's the easiest way to pick up the most marks in writing the fewest number of words.